Welcome back to another Outdoor Philosophy with Switched to Linux. So today what we're going to do is have a look at Chapter 2 in Building a Bridge to the 18th Century. And what we're going to look at here is Postman looks at the rise of rationalism versus Romanticism, which in this period of time he's talking about in the 18th century really was the major battle going on. Now, every culture and every age has its own battle that we need to be aware of. In our age, we don't have Romanticism versus rationalism. We generally have a postmodernism versus postmodern, I don't even know what you call it afterwards, where part of our culture sticks onto the more conservative views and goes, we're going into weird and radical and strange places, and another about 50% or so of our culture looks at everything else and goes, we need to throw off all of this old stuff and move on to something new. And I don't even have a name for what we have now, but it's drawing its lines between what you might call the social justice guys and things like that, and the more conservative views that look at this and go, what, can't you look in your pants and determine what you are? And that's really the battle is waging on that front in our day. Well, in the days of the 18th century, you had a different battle waging, and that was that between Romanticism and rationalism. And so we want to look at what these views are, and so we have a couple definitions. So Postman tells us when we speak of Romanticism, we speak of a rejection of the presumptions of rationalism and an important idea for people like ourselves to consider, but only after we are clear about what rationalism is, or at least what it was in the 18th century. These things do shift their definitions. There are those among us today who would fancy themselves within the rationalist tradition, but who are in fact strangers to it. It is worthwhile to review the matter with some care. He says, to begin with, rationalism was a denial of the Christian belief in the supernatural and, therefore, a rejection of God. This is not to say that all or even most of the 18th century rationalists turned irrevocably away from Christianity or God. And really, we'll stop there. And this is what I talk about a lot on my other channel, where there's this big challenge between when I'm hearing people discussing and debating the validity of Christianity, and anytime they go back into history, you're going back into places that those supposed churches were not following the commands of Scripture. I reject them as any representation of Christianity. We can have a discussion about what they were, but that's kind of what was going on here. And like I had said in the last video on this, is that in that age there was this battle between the religious guys. And remember, the religious in that era were, if you didn't obey what the church said, it was death. And so you have the rationalist view begins to reject all of that. Now, to counteract that, the romantic view says, no, we need to keep on to some element of that. Maybe not in the exact form of whatever the church of the day and the time was preaching. Obviously, in that period of time, we had the Anglican Church, we had the Roman Church, we had the Orthodox Church. What we would call today as Protestantism really wasn't there. There were pockets of Reformation, but we didn't have like the American experiment quite as full-fledged as we have it now. That actually happened a little bit later, around the 1800s. So 19th century is really where the denominationalism or the Protestantism came from, which was more another extension of the American experiment in politics and economics. And so now these battles were going on before all of that. So people were just getting off, and I used the term a creepy malaise of the religious oppression last time. And that's kind of where people were getting away from this. And then this kind of broke down into the areas that wanted to maintain some degree of humanity, and other people who would want to reject all degree of religiosity and the exclusive pursuit of science. And that is kind of where this battle was raging. And one of the things he says in here is, this is neat. The relationship between rationalism and Christianity is a very complex one, expressed with some irony in Crane Britton's remark that the, quote, Enlightenment is the child of Christianity, which may explain for our Freudian times why the Enlightenment is so hostile to it. Of course, he's invoking the picture of how teenagers rebel against their parents. That's the view he's trying to make in this rationality going on. And so what was going on in this period of time is this rationality jumped up and started to wage a war. And we have this quote actually from Voltaire. It says, "You have been spoken to 100 times by the insolent absurdity with which you condemned Galileo, and I speak to you for the 101st. I hope you will keep the anniversary of that event forever. Would you hold that there might be engraved on the door of your holy office, 'Here 7 cardinals, assisted by minor brethren, had the finest thinker of Italy thrown into prison at age 27, made him fast on bread and water because he instructed the human race, because they were ignorant.'" That is, if religion oppresses your knowledge, that's a problem. And that is one of those signs of a cult, is they dictate what you are and are not allowed to see. Now, we're not talking about parental guidance over their children's entertainment or literature. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the things that you find in Jehovah's Witness cults and some Mormon cults, where people are in those churches are forbidden to read things that are contrary to their teaching or critical of their teaching. It's actually forbidden in the codes. And anytime you have that type of forbiddenness, that is what he is talking about. He says it is not true, as some rationalists believe, that science originated in the 18th century. And that's something I had mentioned briefly before in the last week's video, where some people will say that Christianity has just held science back, and we have to get rid of Christianity and support a purely atheistic viewpoint in order to progress in science. And I have dealt with that several times on my other channel, so I'll put some links over there. You can check that out. I'm not going to elaborate on that here, but we're just kind of bringing these up because these were the things going on in the rational debate that he is talking about. And I'll tell you out too as well, if you're unaware, Postman is not affiliated with any religious group, at least to anybody's real public knowledge. He goes on, but neither of these traditions is there a notion of progress comparable which was developed during the Enlightenment. Now, this is where we start to get into the word progress. Of course, this chapter is called Progress, and we start talking about what is progress. And he never concisely defines it, but reading the context clues throughout the chapter, Postman here is talking about progress as a progression towards a greater, better good. And that is kind of where he's going with it. And with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the rest. So we have this battle as to where did the concept of Romanticism, which we haven't defined yet. Romanticism itself is holding on to a degree of the elements of humanity. It's holding on to the poetry, to the literature. This is really the difference between going to a modern university and having the difference between studying the liberal arts on the one hand and studying the you had liberal arts on the one hand, and you had your hard sciences on the other. And oftentimes, if you spend any time in a university, you know there's some degree of conflict involved in there. You know, the liberal arts groups are going to say there, oh, how hard this class is, and the engineer students like, shut up. And I get it, and unfortunately, I'm probably biased in that way because I was in the hard sciences at university. So you have to keep that, you know, that degree in mind, is that really rationalism versus romanticism is a battle between the liberal arts of emotion, feeling, appeal, and the hard sciences, which was only based upon measurements. And really the person that rose up to really defend romanticism against rationality was himself, quote, a child of rationalism, and that was Rousseau. So Rousseau, in other words, Postman writes on page 30, was a child of rationalism, and yet clearly is the most disobedient and disruptive child. Once again, invoking that image from earlier in the chapter that as a child of it, he rebelled against it. And he wrote a speech in 1749, and the speech was, quote, "Has progress of sciences and arts contributed to corrupt or to purify morality?" So, of course, Rousseau's view is that all of this blind science is devoid of asking that very question from Malcolm in Jurassic Park. Should we do this? We can do it. Should we? And that is really the whole core of what Rousseau was trying to ask. So after several books, lectures, teachings, things like that. Postman writes on page 31, by the time he was through, Rousseau had created what might be called the cult of nature, had revealed the limitations of reason, and effectively championed the superiority of poetic insight and institution, had raised his culture's consciousness of the uniqueness of childhood, had amplified the importance of the individual far beyond where Rousseau had taken it, and we might say he had fathered the modern introspective literature. And so this is that, if you're reading something, are you seeking to learn from it? And that is kind of what the heart is. One of Rousseau's followers, a poet by the name of Shelley, wrote down in an essay in defense of poetry, scientific and technological advances could proceed without an ethical basis, but it is not the case with social progress. Instead, indeed, in science and technology claim to provide ethical imperatives, we are led into a moral catastrophe. And this is kind of an interesting thing, because when I'd gone through all my undergrad years and hadn't done anything on ethics. At that time, it really wasn't required, although it is now. But once I hit graduate school, we were required to take courses on bioethics, which we watched these horrible videos from PETA. I'm pretty sure PETA had to do with this class. I don't know. But we had to watch these ethics in the biological science, and now everyone, undergraduate and graduate levels, has to sit through ethics. And Chip Ingram wrote in a fabulous sermon, he says, yeah, we all agree we need ethics because morality is running out of control. What we can't agree on is whose ethics do we actually use? And it raises that fascinating question, because in a postmodern world where everybody makes their own truth, whose ethics do we pick as the core of our foundation? And that's at the heart of the battle that's raging in our century right now. It's not a matter of do we need ethics, but whose ethics? And that is sort of the beginning part of this, is where he's starting to talk about this, because science in and of itself, it does not ask inherently ethical questions. It takes the romantics to ask those questions. Yes, for sure, we could clone another human. We could take a person as they're born, make a clone of them as they're born, raise that baby in some crazy bubble somewhere, and if that person ever loses a finger, we have a perfectly good clone over here. We can chop off the finger and graft it onto the other person. Science doesn't ask if that's a morally ethical thing, but that's a question we need to ask, and that is kind of at the heart of what we're talking about. And so he says, we do not have to discover a new morality. We need only recover what was already at hand, thus suggesting that our moral universe is more familiar, accessible, and practical than is usually believed. And this is kind of where we see our modern day fight and our modern day war once again. The challenge is that we're getting a lot of companies in our modern days who will run over people, who will not care about the person. They don't care about you or me any more than how much money can they extract as us. We are the widgets, the units of production, the things to be bought and sold. We are the product of the elite. And what the take-home message of this section happens to be is that we as an individual societies have to hold accountable the people, particularly in higher office, to maintain that degree of morality, realizing that the human right is the greatest right, and no one, elite or otherwise, has the right or the ability to dictate what somebody else can or should do in that respect. And that is really the heart of it, is that as we are progressing on in what we call progress, our culture is getting worse and worse and worse, because for all of the technological advances we have lost the battle of morality. We have forgotten what is at the heart and the soul, the care for the people. We have forgotten to feed the hungry. We have forgotten to help those in less fortunate situations. We have forgotten to help, give a hand up. As some people would say, teach a man to fish. That is what we've forgotten how to do. And in this section on progress, as Postman goes back and examines that debate, think about the issues, the wars and the debates we have in our days, and is there a better way? What can we as an individual do? Because we can't rely on some big company to change their policies, but what can you do? Can you stop using a service in replace of another one that is more friendly to fellow man? Can we care more about other people. That is really at the heart of this matter. Is he discussed greatly the rationalism versus romanticism battle waging, but we don't have that battle in our day. We've moved beyond rationalism. We've moved through modernism into postmodernism. We are now after postmodernism, and I don't even know the name of it. And it might be, and if somebody's a philosopher and you can tell me what's after postmodernism, I'm curious to know. But let me know what you think about this discussion down below. Once again, you can pick up a copy of this book. I'll put some links. I'll put some links to the Amazon page down below, and you can also help support the channel at switchtolinux.com/support. And you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/TomM. And I do have things like t-shirts, coffee cups, etc. available at shop.switch2linux.com. So thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.